Hello, I'm James Dedarian, Director of the Center for International Security Studies, and I am delighted to be here in the media space and out of my dining room for our second of the COVID Crisis Global Forum 2020 shows. I'm delighted to be here with our able staff. We have Jacob, Taylor, and we have Jose in the control room, and Claire directing things from afar. So thank you all for joining us. We have a very good show. I want to say a word or two about the Global Forum and then introduce our host today. The Global Forum tries to, or does so far, bring together international security experts to explore the most pressing global issues in a timely manner. And we're designing it as a sort of interim report. It's between the first cut of history, the journalistic first cut, and the academic journal that follows often months later. So we're going out live as the circumstances dictate for as long as necessary. And we also wanted to let you know that we'll be recording this for the hearing impaired. It'll be transcribed and made available on the CISS YouTube site. And before I introduce today's topic and host, I also want to pay my respects to the traditional elders of this land, the Cadigal people of the Eora Nation. I wish not only to recognize them, past, present, and emerging, but also I want to acknowledge that there's a long history. We should acknowledge the memory of those who died in the very first pandemic recorded in this region, when at least 50% of the Gadigal population were wiped out by the European smallpox in 1789. Now, history is, I think, a necessary reminder of pandemics being fundamentally human. They're human tragedies in which everyone is at risk, but not equally so. Political, economic, demographic, gendered, and racial factors can mitigate as well as elevate the risk and fear factors. So above all else, I think the COVID pandemic needs to be understood as a human security issue. And that's going to be front and foremost in our presentations over the coming weeks. Now, we're in a world still composed of sovereign states, and that means that human security issues take on a geopolitical character. And in this case, it's reflected in our topic today. As you can see, we're going to be looking at China on the march, which, in keeping with the critical interrogation ethos of the Center for International Security Studies, comes with a question mark. We're going to be assembling some experts to deal with this, come up with some answers. And in search of answers and leading the search, we're going to be, we are fortunate to have with us Professor Justin Hastings, who's the Professor of International Relations and Comparative Politics here at the University of Sydney. He's also the research leader of our security program, our regional security program. And that research focuses primarily on Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, East Africa, and he really does some fascinating work on everything from piracy, maritime security, insurgency, gray and black markets, and nuclear weapons, proliferation in the region. So Justin's going to introduce our topic and our participants, who provide a short analysis of the impact of the COVID pandemic, and largely from the perspective of their own research interest. And we're going to make a first pass at the lessons learned, and then some informed speculation about where we go next. Hopefully we will learn some lessons from this pandemic, because it will not be the last, I'm afraid, serious global event that's going to be affecting the international system. So we want to make the Global Forum as interactive as possible. So if you'd like to join us in the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom box, not the chat function, but the Q&A function. So with that, I wish to welcome Professor Justin Hastings and thank him for putting together today's forum on China on the March.
Welcome. I'm Justin Hastings, and I have an august panel of people associated with the University of Sydney here with me today to talk about the question, China on the March. Is China on the March? This question arose because we've seen especially since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, a very sort of aggressive or provocative or maybe confident behavior by China, not only in the Asia Pacific, but around the world. We've seen China, for example, sort of send supplies to many affected countries by COVID. At the same time, we've seen a number of moves by China to strengthen its position or to provide inducements, both positive and negative, to many countries around the world to basically do what China wants, or to act in China's interests. So in some sense, we've seen things like China fortifying the South China Sea. More recently, we saw a clash between Chinese and Indian soldiers over disputed territory in the Himalayas. And closer to home with Australia, we've seen a series of perhaps negative inducements by China to Australia in terms of sort of export and tariff restrictions on various Australian exports, a warning to Chinese tourists and students not to go to Australia. And sort of more generally, we've seen some wolf warrior diplomacy, sort of diplomats engage in very trenchant comments and sometimes even threats to countries that don't toe the line. And now most recently, we've seen, in some sense, Australia's government basically announcing that, in fact, there had been this series of cyber attacks or cyber probes over the past couple of years, sort of implicitly blaming China for this. And so the question we have is, well, is there a pattern, right? Is this actually an example of China on the march? Why is China doing this? Is there a strategy behind this? China for decades was guided by the maxim of Deng Xiaoping that you would basically sort of bide your time, build your strength, and make sure that no alliances form against you. And in some sense, that seems to have gone by the wayside, and now we have a different sort of strategy behind Chinese behavior. What's driving this? What are the domestic drivers of China's behavior? Are there foreign drivers, for example? How much of China's behavior can be explained by Xi Jinping specifically, and how much it can be explained by a general change in China's view of the world? And then we ask the question, well, what does this mean? What are the implications of this? China's moves, what effect does this have on the global economy? What effect does this have on China's role in globalization or China's trade links between China and the rest of the world? And what does this mean for changing alignment structures in the Indo-Pacific? And then finally, we can ask the question, well, what do we do about it? In Australia, is there anything Australia could or should do? How does this affect Australia's behavior? And sort of what does this mean for the sort of long-term trends post-COVID in the Indo-Pacific? So we have four people who will discuss this. Sort of the first, in no particular order, is Minglu Chen, who is an expert on Chinese domestic politics here in the Government International Relations Department. Then we have Tom Wilkins, who's an expert on Indo-Pacific foreign policy and security studies in the Government International Relations Department. We have Simon Ray Atkinson, who is an affiliate of CISS and sort of does many interesting work and projects for the Royal Australian Navy. And finally, we have Salvatore Barbones, who's an associate professor in the sociology department and is an expert on China and economic globalization. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll have each participant sort of talk for maybe 5 minutes. And then we can, once everyone's talked, we can then move on to Q&A and a sort of free-warming discussion to have everyone say their bit. Okay, so first, just going by the screen, why don't we have Salvatore kick us off?
Thanks for letting me talk. Look, China on the march, I would rename the forum China Staggers Forward. I mean, if we look around the clock, China is what we used to call at war with India. It has confrontations ongoing with both Vietnam and Malaysia in the South China Sea, an airspace duel with Taiwan. Of course, Okinawa Prefecture has just tried to change the name of the Senkaku Islands in another confrontation with China. There's the big coronavirus investigation of the World Health Organization, which will inevitably focus on China's role in the coronavirus epidemic. Belt and Road is in shambles with countries, well, everywhere other than Victoria, people wanting to pull out of projects or projects behind schedule, things going wrong. Hong Kong is in flames in permanent crisis. Huawei, China's leading hardware technology company, is being dismantled, there's no other word for it, by the United States and by United States sanctions. The phase one trade deal with the United States is under severe pressure. It's holding for now, but we'll see if that trade deal holds. And China's economy was stagnant before the coronavirus. I mean, if you believe that China was growing at more than 6%, I have a bridge to sell you in Sydney Harbor. An economy growing at 6% in 2019 wouldn't have had declining auto sales, declining mobile phone sales, flat exports. It takes a massive leap of faith to believe that the Chinese economy was growing before the crisis. Instrumental variable models, which use things like nighttime lights and transport movements and things like that to try to impute economic growth, estimate that in 2019, China was growing at 3 to 3.5%. And that's just growth. That doesn't mean that that's sustainable or meaningful growth. So for example, China had steel overproduction of, by its own estimate, of 100 million tons a year. Now that's equivalent to the entire United States output, or I'm sorry, United States consumption of steel. So while there was maybe 3.5% growth, that growth was being poured into things like building apartments no one's going to live in, building mountains of steel that no one's ever going to use. Well, is that growth? In a technical sense, that is output, but that's not output that contributes to anybody's well-being or resources. We have ghost cities rising in China. I mean, a rising problem of a payments crisis. We've shifted from talk of a credit crisis in China to talk of a payments crisis, as companies that used to be paying their bills within 60 days are now taking 120 days to pay their bills. In fact, the government even had to order state-owned companies to start paying their bills because no one has the cash to pay their bills. And finally, the ever stricter currency controls in China. The Chinese yuan broke through the kind of mystical 7 yuan per US dollar barrier last year. It has stayed down, yet China is having to put tighter and tighter controls on the yuan to prevent a further deterioration in the currency. Now, an economy that's growing, or that was growing at 6%, shouldn't be struggling to maintain its currency. If anything, it should be struggling to keep its currency from rising, not struggling to keep it from collapsing. Really, China is staggering forward on all these fronts with a last gasp of energy that I don't think can last for very long. And I really think what we're going to see as the year wears on, and certainly in 2021, is a retrenchment towards what I might call fortress China. We already have a fortress China when it comes to the internet. Instead of having an offensive stance on the internet, that is, its companies trying to go abroad, they've largely been limited to going abroad into the diaspora communities overseas, with the one exception of TikTok. And mark my words, this time next year, TikTok will have collapsed in Western markets. It's not going to have the kind of cultural dominance it does at this very moment. And China's already built a firewall around its internet. I think we're going to increasingly see the walls going up around the rest of China. And that means both in security terms, but also in economic terms. I think we're going to see a retrenchment towards everyone likes to talk about China's historical place in the world. Pro-China scholars make that China's rightful place in the world. But if you look at China's historical place in the world, it is as a walled garden. The kind of Ming China approach to the world, where it was actually a crime to leave the country. The country was so closed off that you weren't legally allowed to leave. And if you left, you came back under pain of death. Now, I don't think China is going to introduce a death penalty for returnees anytime soon. But I do think 2021 is going to see a fortress China, not a China on the march.
Thanks. We'll have questions after all the speakers. Let's move on to Tom Wilkins. Next down my line.
Well, I wouldn't disagree that China has problems, and there was a lot of economic problems pointed out there by Salvatore. But I don't think that means that China doesn't have a strategic plan and it isn't still powerful, and that we should sort of drop our guard and relax our defenses on this score. I mean, I think that a lot of its behavior has basically been a continuation and in some ways a kind of intensification of trends that we could see before the coronavirus. And in some ways, as Justin pointed out at the beginning, you know, we've seen these activities in Hong Kong, in South China Sea, border tensions with India and everything ramped up. And I think maybe a partial explanation for this is a sort of a kind of proactive or almost kind of offensive defense. I mean, obviously, you know, there's no disputing that China was the source of the coronavirus, and you know, in some respects, bears responsibility for that. And so this is a way of kind of detracting from that by sort of perhaps aggravating other issues. I mean, witness the pile on to Australia for wanting an inquiry into this. It's not something that they really want to sort of stand up and sort of talk about accountability for. So I think they're kind of using this in some ways, exploiting the conditions created by the crisis and the fact that they haven't suffered anywhere near as badly as some of the other leading powers, especially the United States and the UK and so forth, as a little bit of a window of opportunity to just continue these kind of incremental or salami slicing tactics, while the United States itself is mired in chaos. I think we have to be relative about this. China's got problems, but I mean, the United States doesn't look in tip-toppity shape, as Trump likes to say. So I think you know, we perhaps need to take a bit of a relative perspective on what Salvatore pointed out. I don't dispute it, but so yeah, I would probably just conclude by saying that, you know, they are trying to advance a sort of a master plan, something like you know, Michael Pillsbury pointed out in his 100-year marathon, and that you know, we've seen in some of the other Chinese writings. Thanks.
Great. Why don't we move on to look into in depth in sort of the drivers of China's behavior from Ming Lu.
Thank you, Justin. I try to be brief. So I'm just trying to say something really simple here, which is domestic politics really matter in China's external policy making. In another way, it is really China's internal situations shape its external behaviors. So just following on what Salvatore was talking about, I want to give you a few details and figures of China's recent economic decline. So for the first time, I think over quite a few decades, in the first quarter of this year, China's economy was experiencing its first contraction of 6%, right? Another number 6 was recently China's Premier Li Keqiang at the National People's Congress annual meeting said China's current unemployment rate is 6%. Right? It probably doesn't sound very big, but considering the size of the Chinese population, actually the number of people currently without jobs is really significant. Another number 6 was also from Premier Li Keqiang. He said, I think probably a week or 2 ago at the press conference, it was quite surprising because given the current narrative of Xi Jinping that China is trying to achieve a moderately prosperous society, whatever that means, Li Keqiang actually said in the press conference, currently there are 6 million Chinese people who have a monthly income of less than 1,000 RMB, which is less than 300, I think about 200 Australian dollars. So that is really a kind of a shocking situation probably to many people. So when we talk about China's grand strategy or China's master plan, I think a very important thing that we need to think of is what are the key interests that drive this master plan or the grand strategy. When we talk about China here, we talk about the Chinese Communist Party state. Right? I think at least one of the very key strategy for the Chinese Communist Party state is its own survival. Right? How does its everlasting task is to prove that it has the right to rule the country. Right? In the past, during the Mao era, I think that was not too hard, right? Because the communist ideology just bind the country together. And for a long time, I think when the communist ideology is becoming less and less relevant, this legitimacy is performance-based. But now the economy is starting to decline. Where does China or the Chinese state claim its source of legitimacy? I think that is why partially the reason behind the recent, or actually not very recent, it has been like this for a while, of this aggressive behavior, right? Nationalist sentiments are very powerful. It is a very powerful tool in time of crisis, particularly now that Chinese state is facing internal criticism, right? Which was caused by the early policy failure that it was trying to do with the virus breakout. Recently, I think in February, when I was in China, I remember seeing on the news when Deputy Premier Sun Chunlan was having an inspection tour in Wuhan of the post-virus situation. Someone, a local Wuhan resident, shouted out of his or her window that this is all fake. So to me, it's very obvious frustration and mistrust. So I guess in this circumstance, the Chinese party state has no choice, or the one very convenient and powerful tool it has is to call upon this nationalistic sentiment and try to behave in a way that it could demonstrate to the Chinese society that the Chinese Communist Party is still able to lead the country through the crisis and provide for the people. I think I'll stop here.
Thanks very much. And finally, Simon, what do you have to say about this?
Thanks very much. I'm reminded of what Marquis of Halifax said in 1694. What shall we do to be saved in this world? And he answered himself, there is no answer but this, look to your moat. I think we have to think of the vulnerability of China, in particular in the area of Korea. It had to fight a war of existential survival. The Communist Party did shortly after the success of its revolution against the US. There's nothing more than I think Xi would like to have settlement in the Korean Peninsula. And there's a very great vulnerability there, given the structure. The vulnerability of the Yangtze, which was where the European and indeed American penetration of China occurred to lead to the 100 years of humiliation. And then there's the way in which essentially the Chinese Civil War was won, which was a land to sea objective maneuver, when essentially they moved from land to capture the forts and dominate the Yangtze, which is an existential vulnerability to China, which I think we need to be aware of. I think given COVID, and I agree with all our speakers, are we looking at an explosion or an implosion at the same time? And a question we might need to figure in is, how do we actually help China rather than perhaps taking up and building our own fortresses and moats? From an Australia's perspective, as Professor Boger and I suggested some 2 years ago now, one of our vulnerabilities is an unassumed sovereignty. As Professor Roy McLeod recognized, 1917 was an existential shock for Australia in terms of fatalities that came back from the First World War, and a population then of only about 5 million. And he and some work in Melbourne suggests that it's taken us 100 years to recover from the meta shock to that young country. And we then have 1942 and a sort of move from a British sovereignty or suzerainty to an American one. And that unassumed sovereignty means that we don't necessarily have our own philosophy linked to the sovereignty, and therefore an ability to express our own interests and values, which at this time could be really very important as identifiable and separable from perhaps Europe and certainly the United States. I'm reminded on China of Yakin Quinn's relational theory of world politics 2016, which in a sum was looking at let 100 rules of world order contend, obviously based on Mao's let 1,000 flowers blow. And basically they were challenging there, and the philosophy there is to challenge the so-called global rule-based order. What I think we're probably looking at is a replacement of the old global rules-based order with perhaps a new values-based order. And if we need those values, then we probably need to have an assumed sovereignty to understand what those values are that we are actually promoting at this particular stage. If I look at the United States, I do believe they're structurally weakened and wounded, and partly from the BLM protests that we've seen, understandable as they are, in a very divided society. I think we may be looking at a new republic, the emergence of a new republic, the third or fourth republic, depending on how one looks at the republics have formed since the revolution. I think we're significantly divided. And the divisions are not being healed at the moment by the media and the professional academics and elites, many of whom are perhaps pursuing their own agendas. And I think America itself dangerously is unsure what success looks like. And that's driving the sort of centripetal forces of isolationism. I think America is in a very unstable place in some, and I think that could give rise to miscalculations. And finally, I wonder about the impact of quantum, AI, and nanotechnology on all of the above. Toby Orb, in his book Precipice, estimated the highest risk of what he called existential catastrophe in the next 100 years, which he assessed as 1 in 10, is the impact of quantum, AI, and nanotechnology on humanity. So I think we've got 3 instabilities occurring at the same time, just as we're moving potentially into a new political, economic, if you like, space, a juncture from where we were. That's all I've got to say, Justin.
Thanks very much. So the first question is there much substantive domestic opposition to Xi Jinping's foreign and strategic policy? And I think this sort of speaks to the question of how is China's foreign policy and strategic policy actually made? So is Xi Jinping doing it himself? Is this a sort of something that's new relative to how Chinese foreign policy was made in the past? And ultimately, sort of who is getting the information? Sorry. And who's giving the information that's necessary for China to make its foreign policy? And sort of the follow-on to that is, if Xi Jinping is at the center of it, to what extent is his position secure? Is this a Xi Jinping issue, or is this a sort of ultimately a sort of a what you might call a structural issue with related to how China is rising in the world? Minglu, maybe you can comment on that, or Salvatore as well.
Actually, I don't really know who makes China's foreign policies. I wonder how many people in this world actually know the answer to this question. But I imagine, while there is a Minister of Foreign Affairs, I don't think the ministry actually plays a very important role in here. Really, it's the party's foreign affairs working group that probably makes the major decisions, and the military certainly has a very large say in this. But then the major state-owned enterprises which have large investment in certain countries, they would share their opinions, and they would have a say in certain policy making process as well. I think the way to look at this is we always, outside China, when we talk about China, we kind of look at China as the monolithic unity, but it is not. We have to distinguish between the party state, the society, and also people hold different opinions. And there is the business sector who always have their interest which they want to safeguard. So are there oppositions to Xi Jinping's foreign policies? I think probably among his colleagues, there are some who are not so hawkish, but are there oppositions from the society? Unfortunately, from the Indian case, I don't see a lot of opposition from the Chinese people. I think the key problem here is really the Chinese general public doesn't have a lot of access to information, right? So whenever there is a conflict or a report on a conflict between China and India, people simply don't know enough of what is happening in India. Then I think a lot of domestic responses from the Chinese general public is, oh yes, we should be more assertive and even aggressive. But that to me is a major problem. I'll pass on to Salvatore.
Oh, sure. Look, Minglu said in her opening that the Chinese regime believes in the concept of performance legitimacy. That's Samuel Huntington's idea that that a regime can get by as long as it performs well. They believe in it because a lot of Chinese academics went abroad for education in the 1990s and learned Samuel Huntington's newest ideas, and now they're running the country. It's simply not true. You don't need performance legitimacy. Bashar al-Assad showed that in Syria. Any ruler who maintains the loyalty of the military and is willing to shoot his or her own people will stay in power. And China showed that in 1989. Kim Jong-un shows that in Korea. The Egyptian military has shown that Mubarak didn't shoot protesters and he was swept from power. Al-Sisi has shot a lot of protesters and he is firmly in power. Regimes don't get swept away by protests. They crumble from an unwillingness, and I think in many cases, a welcome unwillingness to shed blood. I don't advocate evil regime staying in power. I simply note that if an evil regime wants to stay in power, it's always able to.
Just to add, one of the things that I noted in my own work, on sort of North Korea, is that at the beginning of Xi Jinping's rule, there was a debate within China, among academics and foreign policy analysts, about whether China should abandon North Korea, right? Because obviously North Korea is not necessarily a net positive for China. As Xi Jinping's tenure has gone on, that debate has basically ended, right? So in that sense, we see an actual sort of, maybe a collapse in sort of robust debate, at least as occurs in public regarding at least sensitive Chinese foreign policy issues. The next question we have is about mass surveillance. So one of the ways in which China has addressed COVID within China itself is, with what you might call extreme forms of social control and mass surveillance. And, sort of at least from the outside, they seem to have worked somewhat well in containing COVID, at least until relatively recently. So the question is, well, what does this mean for the rest of the world? What effect will this have on China's export of mass surveillance to sort of the rest of the world, on sort of security in the region, and on how we think about, sort of addressing issues posed by China in the Indo-Pacific? Simon, maybe you have something to say about that.
I was hoping you weren't going to ask.
Right.
I think the mass surveillance is obviously a control measure, and I suspect, and this is where maybe Hawaii's come undone, is how linked is that control and rule measure to the economy and the transfer of wealth between the various hinterlands, the western provinces, and the coastal states, into which, broadly speaking, China can be divided. And the further west you go, the more opposition there is, as we know, and we have the whole lockdown of a significant proportion of the population in the western states, which is being controlled through the surveillance system and almost a sort of surveillance concentration basis. Yes, I mean, I agree with Salvatore, you can only keep that going for so long. One of the issues, I think, if we come back to the political economy, is the cost of that. And essentially, we have, whether we like it or not, a capitalized communist economy. But what has our response been to date? Well, our response to a certain extent has moved towards surveillance systems with the apps and other structures we have, albeit on a voluntary basis. But we have nevertheless nationalized significant elements of our industry. So my question is, can we, within a control surveillance system, a rule-based economy, can we actually revitalize that economy back into being a market economy? In other words, I don't think you're going to succeed if you place a communist economy versus a nationalized economy. And you need to have that revitalization. And I don't believe you'll have that vitalization as long as you're controlling that degree of surveillance and a huge cost that goes with it, both in terms of, if you like, social cost, but also actually the whole financial cost. Thousands of people acting as mini policemen, monitoring other people, give or take AI. That's it.
Great. The next question we have is about resilience, and I think we see how China has dealt with the pandemic in terms of the social controls, the surveillance as we discussed, and the legal regime that's instituted. And so the question is, well, how resilient is China relative to other countries in the world? And I think the following question of this would be, what effect does this have on security, right? Is the country that recovers first the country that wins in the Indo-Pacific? Or is this not really how we should be thinking about pandemics at all? Obviously, sort of recovering from a pandemic is not a zero-sum game, right? In theory, you want everyone to be able to recover. So if we think about resilience and its effect on security, what does this mean for say China's place now in the Indo-Pacific? Tom, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think maybe that China is a little more resilient than the facts and figures that Salvatore blinded us with. I think it still has a huge amount of critical mass and and a strong degree of control over over regional affairs, and they'll continue to advance its plan to sort of push out its space in the international order. In terms of pandemic resilience, I mean, the thing is, you get a situation where everybody focuses on the crisis at hand, and then becomes incredibly well prepared for tackling a repeat of that. But of course, the next crisis is not a repeat of the crisis that's just happened. It'll be a black swan. I mean, some people have called the COVID crisis a black swan, but it wasn't, because I mean everybody predicted this, and we had precursors to this with SARS and so forth. I think they'll have certainly learned some lessons about how they handle these kind of predictable but unexpected crises in future. But it really demonstrates, I think, going back to the three previous sort of comments, this sort of obsession with internal control and ramping up internal control. And I wanted, actually, if you don't mind, just to sort of to segue on from the three previous speakers when they were talking about this kind of surveillance, the need for legitimacy based upon internal control. And certainly, I think that that Xi Jinping is in a difficult dilemma, because he's got domestic interests he needs to pursue, but these, of course, are subject to interdomestic politics. So they have international ramifications. I mean, this is just a given now. So I mean, one of the things that I thought that would perhaps come up is the situation in Hong Kong as an example of them wanting to sort of increase repressive measures or increase control over this kind of wayward special administrative region. And in that sense, it does seem that the CCP is putting domestic politics above international considerations when it comes to Hong Kong. Like they don't seem to care the sort of the reputational damage that this is causing. This may be something that really Xi Jinping has sort of staked his reputation upon, or something he really feels is a sort of a open sore that needs to be, or a boil that needs to be lanced. But I think this the sort of the continued protests and the sort of repressive responses, some of them through this new national security law that they're pushing through, is perhaps doing more harm than good, both in terms of internal politics, but certainly in terms of international politics and reputational politics. I mean, in the long term, you could find that China already has some issues with sort of insurgent / separatists, whatever you want to call them, movements within the larger Chinese state in Xinjiang, Tibet, and so forth. But I think rather than sort of stabilizing or solving this problem in Hong Kong, which is far more visible and that external stakeholders seem to care a lot more about and be a lot more connected to, rather than solving or stabilizing it, they sort of seem to be responding to the failure of repression with more repression. And I really think that there's not a chance that external actors will ignore this and just say, oh, okay, we'll turn a blind eye to that. So while China is obsessed with preventing intervention in its sovereignty, although it doesn't necessarily practice what it preaches when it comes to other countries, I think this is really inviting intervention in the affairs of Hong Kong, and it already just adds to the damage that the PRC image has suffered thanks to COVID. So I think those are those internal sort of repressive or control and legitimacy dynamics certainly have external ramifications. And I think if the West or interested parties were not in such disarray, then there'd be a lot more pushback than there actually is. Sort of seems to have gone quiet a little bit at the moment. So I just wanted to add that, just because right. I had more to say about the previous question round. Thanks.
Well, so I guess sort of the follow-on questions here to put to the panel is about Japan. What about Japan? All right, so in the question they say that Japan is the most trusted country in Southeast Asia. And I think sort of in some ways you can link this to Southeast Asia and attempts by many countries to, I don't want to say go around China, but to provide alternative pathways to influence in Asia. India has a look east policy, Taiwan and Japan both have a look south policy, all focusing on Southeast Asia instead of China. And so this leads to a two-part question. What about Japan? Is this Japan's time to shine? Is this a moment when Japan, as sort of one of the other sort of great powers of Asia or middle powers of the world, can make its move and sort of when it can establish some sort of influence in the region? Any of the panelists, feel free to comment.
Is okay if I jump in on there? So
Oh,
yeah, I do a fair bit of work on this, and sorry to just to hog the mic, but yeah, I think this is potentially a time for Japan to shine. I'm not sure if they're ready for prime time. They're sort of trying to give the impression that they are. I mean, they've got their own troubles. I mean, the loss of the Olympics this year, or the cancellation of the Olympics postponement, was a huge blow to their sort of national psyche and self-esteem. But they have, if you look at what Japan's been doing over the last few years, they're becoming more and more proactive, more and more engaged, more and more sort of on the front foot. Things that should really sort of advertise this are this is a little bit earlier, but the quite strong sort of nationalist-leaning government of Abe Shinzo, and his slogan that Japan is back. And he's done quite a lot to sort of push that through on the international scene. One of their flagship policies is this free and open Indo-Pacific. And this, is very, very interesting initiative, because the Japanese launched it in 2016 as a sort of a strategy or a vision. They toned it down from a strategy because it sounded a bit hard for the Japanese to a vision, which was a bit more soft power kind of thing. But the interesting thing is that this contains upholding the rules-based order, values-based diplomacy, that we can also get back to, but also that the United States then adopted it about a year or two later and made this a centerpiece of their own Indo-Pacific strategic report. And so it's both brought those countries together. Australia is kind of slipstream behind this, although it doesn't use the exact word. Again, India is slipstream behind this as well. So you are sort of seeing a consolidation of these sort of these countries that have shared concerns over China, and like-minded countries with shared values. And Japan has been doing a hell of a lot to sort of catalyze this. Particularly, I mean, we're definitely going to see India and Japan come closer together now as a result of it. Japan has been pushing hard. India is really waking up to this now, and they have this sort of strategic partnership. But Japan has built these strategic partnerships all around Southeast Asia, with India, with France, and the UK and everything. So in many ways, I think there's definitely something to that point that this is the time for Japan to show what it's made of and step up to the plate.
Okay, thanks, Simon.
Yes, I think on Japan and with some recent articles by the Japanese Navy looking at their history and formation, there is still a major constitutional issue, Tom, that they will need to address. And I think unlike Germany, which was very much defanged after World War II in Lord Ismay's term, keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in, a maxim for NATO. That never occurred in Japan. And I think there are still shared concerns, particularly in the Chinese community, and also though in Australia and Japan and the United States even, with the lack of atonement from Japan. So I agree with you. I think there are three countries that are on the point of the spear at the moment. That's clearly Australia, it is India, and it is Japan. And I think the sort of four-party alliance, which you infer, is quite significant. And Australia will be contributing to the major maritime exercise occurring, I think, in the next couple of months, in addition to RIMPAC, which China isn't invited to. So I think there are some significant issues there. And primarily, Australia, Japan, and India are going to have to find ways of staying together. But I do think the atonement issue is quite critical, and I don't think it's insubstantial. The opposition within Japan the changing the constitution beyond that which it's currently interpreted to allow for essentially aircraft carriers, lightning II employed on them, and the formation of a new marine within the army.
Okay, great. We have some questions about the cyber attacks, and I think this is a question for Salvatore and Ming Lu. We can sort of transition to, well, what does Australia do about this, right? So, I mean, we have a situation where for a long time, Australia has been, or China has been Australia's major economic trading partner. The US has been Australia's major security partner. And you know, the line in Australia was always that these are not incompatible. But increasingly, especially since COVID and since China's attentions have turned towards Australia, we can see the argument that Australia's economic sort of links with China may become a security liability. And so the question is, well, what does Australia do about this, right? If China is driven primarily by domestic concerns, I mean, is there anything Australia can do? Should Australia see China as an economic partner or as a security threat, or both? Salvatore?
Australia doesn't do anything about the cyber attacks. I mean, the future of the world economy is not in coal, iron ore, or in Chinese terms, exporting toys and mobile phones. The future of the world economy is online. And in that online world, China is shooting itself in the foot with these cyber attacks. I mean, what company would trust its cloud computing to Alibaba? You know, who wants to be on on Baidu for artificial intelligence? The answer is only Chinese company, and the rest of the world is scared off by these things. So, you know, the cyber attacks are going to happen. Australia will raise its defenses, but these kind of cyber attacks have been par for the course in the United States for a long time. They're just part of what dealing with China means, and as people come to realize that, they become less and less trustful, if they ever did trust, Chinese online companies and online initiatives. So the result of this is that the online world increasingly flees from China, and that means fleeing to the United States. I mean, whatever you think of the dominance of Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft, they're the alternative to China, and they're the ones who've sailed through the coronavirus crisis with stock price gains of 40% so far this year. You know, this just reinforces the move to an American internet. So while Australia may have a policy debate, does Australia join the American world at the risk of losing its major trading partner? The fact is, Australian individuals and companies don't want to be part of the Chinese internet. They want to be part of the American internet, and that's where they're going to land.
Great. Ming Lu?
I'm afraid I'll have to say something provocative here. Actually, if you ask people in China, what is China's Australian policy? I don't think there is such a thing. So in other words, people in Zhounanhai, Xi Jinping and his colleagues, I don't think they sit there all day spending a lot of time actually thinking about us here in Australia. That's probably a not very nice thing to say, but I see that as a reality, right? I guess I would recommend to people, if you haven't read it, probably find it to read Fu Ying, who used to be the ambassador here from China to Australia. She later on held position as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. She recently published a long article talking mainly about China-US relations in the post-pandemic era. But she actually mentioned, I think that is really a true reflection of what China thinks of Australia. Right? China understands the Australia-US alliance relationship, and China doesn't expect any change. Right? China understands countries like Australia, they probably won't make a choice between China and the United States. And in her article, she says if they are forced to make such a choice, the choice will not be China. China is very clear of this. Well, in terms of what Australia should do, my opinion is probably Australia doesn't have to do much because China understands Australia's situation. And China is happy with this kind of 正冷经热, cold in politics, hot in economy relationship, not just with Australia, right? With many other countries, Japan, Korea, so on and so forth. So I really don't think we need to do too much. But talking about decoupling with China, whilst we are thinking we need to, I think that's probably something we can do, strengthen our connections with our Indo-Pacific neighbors. But at the same time, China is also trying to decouple with us, right? The Chinese state-owned enterprises recently invested in an iron ore mine in Guinea. So, but that's not going to translate into any economic reality in near future. Probably in the next 10 years, Australia still have to deal with the fact that China is a economic partner, but also a security threat. But I guess we just have to make our policies around this fact with, and also at the same time, bearing in mind that China is aware of the situation as well.
Let me illustrate something Ming Lu just said. I once met with the senior staff of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences Research Center that covers Australia and New Zealand, and they needed a translator because not a single person at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences covering Australia and New Zealand spoke English. And that shows you just where Australia and New Zealand fit in China's security landscape.
Could I just have a very quick intervention on that?
Yeah.
Just very, very quick. I would beg to differ a little bit, because I would think that what we're seeing now is that China is trying to show a demonstration effect to countries like Australia, US allies, middle powers, and say, hey, don't speak up too much. One of the things I've heard a little bit myself is, why is Australia so vocal? And so I think, that I agree. But on the other hand, I think that there's a demonstration effect going on here. Don't step up, be more quiescent, be more acquiescent. Thanks.
Great. Any other thoughts? We're rapidly running out of time. So, I mean, I guess one final question we have that sort of came up, and this relates to security, which is China's military modernization. If China is having economic problems, how will that actually translate into military modernization? How will that translate into threat posed by the PLA or the way in which the PLA behaves? Last word, Simon.
Quite frankly, at the moment, I think the modernization is already committed in their sort of forward 5-year plans, as we know. And they are currently turning out an aircraft carrier the size that we have in Australia every year. You might recognize that there was a fire on board one of their recent Type 75 landing helicopter destroyers, mini carriers. They simply brought forward the second one, and they've got 4 essentially being launched over the next 2 years. Their new Type 75 destroyer is more than a match for the equivalent US, and they've got up to 36 of those that they're turning out over the next 10 years. So they're already committed to that build up, and a lot of their planning is based on depth and the sort of maxim that quality has a quantity all of its own. So in other words, they can afford to take the losses. We can't afford to lose any of our frigates, destroyers, or let alone aircraft carriers without huge political, economic, and military impact. And that goes back to the Chinese approach to the South China Sea, which is very much land to sea objective maneuver. We've always got to reach in. They don't have to. They don't need a blue water capability to achieve that. So I think their mobilization they're committed to, and our response, quite frankly, and maybe helpfully at the moment, is sclerotic at best.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks very much to all the panelists. We'll wrap it up, and I'll sign off so that James Darian can have the final word.
Thank you, Justin. We're doing some hot swapping here, but I just wanted to say thank you to Justin and all the panelists. It's a fantastic broadband, full spectrum, I think, analysis of China in the era of COVID and afterwards. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank as well Jose Toyaba and Claire Hodson for putting this all together, and of course Taylor and Jacob here in the media space. So I hope you can all join us. The questions were great. We're going to carry on. Our next webinar will be July 8th. And the topic's going to be the global anti-racist movements and relationship to COVID, of course, but also to what I think to be our primary concern right now, which is human security. We're going to have a great panel of international guests. So come join us on July 8th. Until then, spread the word, stay safe, be well, be kind, and we're over and out here at the University of Sydney webinar, our Global Forum 2020. Thank you very, very much.